My name is Isabel Foreman. I'm 32, and I'm a senior title examiner at a commercial title insurance firm in Sacramento, California, which means I've spent the last 9 years reading property records so closely that names on a deed jump out at me the way most people notice a familiar face in a crowd. Excluded from my own brother's engagement party because my parents said my situation would embarrass the family in front of his fiance's relatives, I now personally review and clear title on deals worth upward of $30 million a year without a second thought. For months ago, I stood in the doorway of a banquet hall I hadn't been invited into, and a man I'd never met in my life looked at my name tag at the front check-in table, went pale, and said, "Wait, you're that Isabel Foreman?" I didn't understand what he meant yet. But by the time the story ends, I'll tell you exactly how a stranger's double take undid 3 years of my family, quietly pretending I didn't exist. If you're watching this, comment where you're from and what time it is right now for you and hit subscribe because you're going to want to see where this one goes. Let me take you back to where this actually started. My parents, Donald and Carol Foreman, live in a gated community outside Folsom, California, in a house they've owned since 2004. My younger brother, Grant, was always the easy one, charming, photogenic, effortlessly likable in the way some people just are without trying. I was the complicated one, the one who'd gone through a messy, very public divorce at 26 that my mother still referred to 3 years later as Isabel's situation, as though I'd caught something contagious rather than simply left a marriage that wasn't working. The trigger came 2 years ago when my father asked me to co-sign a $180,000 second mortgage against my own townhouse so Grant could put a down payment on a house in the same gated community to keep the family close. I was 30 years old, single, carrying my own mortgage on a townhouse I'd bought with my own title industry salary of $96,000 a year, and I said no. My mother's exact words, standing in my parents' kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in March, the smell of her lemon pound cake still in the oven, were, "You've already embarrassed this family once, Isabel. The least you could do is not stand in the way of your brother having a normal life." I didn't argue. I remember the specific quiet that settled over me. The hum of the refrigerator, the particular stillness of standing in a kitchen where you suddenly understand you're not really welcome in it anymore. I said, "Okay," picked up my purse and drove home. I have never once regretted that no. For 2 years, I built a life almost entirely without them. And I'll move through it quickly because the important part isn't the silence, it's what I was doing quietly underneath it. I got promoted to senior title examiner. I paid off that mortgage 2 years ahead of schedule. I started dating someone kind, a structural engineer named Marcus, who never once asked me to explain my family to him, because he could see for himself how carefully I avoided the subject. Through all of it, I kept a habit from my job that bled into my personal life without me fully noticing. I saved every document, every email, every scrap of correspondence that touched anything financial. In a folder on my laptop, I never bothered to name anything clever. It was just called records. It turned out to matter more than almost anything else I owned. The only contact I got from my family in those 2 years was a group text about Grant's engagement to a woman named Priya Raghavan, whose father, I'd later learn, ran a private real estate investment firm out of the Bay Area. I wasn't invited to the actual engagement party. My mother's text, sent almost as an afterthought 3 days beforehand, read, "We're keeping the guest list small and simple this time. Hope you understand." I understood exactly what she meant. I stayed home that Saturday night, ordered takeout, and told myself it didn't matter as much as it did. Then, 6 weeks ago, everything shifted. Grant called me out of nowhere, warm and friendly in a way he hadn't been in years, asking careful, circling questions about my job, specifically whether I knew a lot about property records and title stuff, and whether I could look into something for him informally. I said sure, more curious than suspicious, and 2 days later he sent me an address in Folsom, a 4-bedroom house he and Priya were buying together, closing in 6 weeks, $1.4 million, most of the down payment coming, he mentioned casually, from Priya's dad as an engagement gift. I ran the title search the same afternoon, out of professional habit more than anything else. And there, buried 3 transactions back in the chain of title, was something that made me sit very still at my desk. The house Grant and Priya were buying had, 11 years earlier, been sold out of a small estate trust, and one of the two named beneficiaries listed on that decade-old transfer was me. My grandmother's estate, settled quietly while I was in college, had apparently included a partial interest in that exact property that had never been formally cleared before it changed hands twice since. Legally, that meant the current sale might not be able to close cleanly without my signature releasing whatever residual claim still technically existed on paper. I called an attorney I knew through work, a careful, precise man named Oscar Delgado, who confirmed within a day that the interest was real, if minor, and that no title company should be closing on that property without resolving it first. Isabel, he said, whoever's underwriting this deal is either sloppy or somebody upstream deliberately buried this because they knew exactly whose name it would surface. I didn't have to wonder long. My mother had apparently known about the original trust interest the whole time. I found this out because Grant, in his usual careless way, forwarded me a family group chat message by mistake, meant for our mother. Don't mention Isabel's name to the title company. Just let them run the standard search and hope it doesn't flag anything. I read that message 4 times in my car. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at the title company's office in Folsom, a beige conference room smelling of stale coffee and new carpet. I hadn't been invited to Grant's engagement party. I absolutely intended to be at his closing. I walked in wearing a plain gray blazer, Oscar Delgado beside me, a folder in my hands instead of a raised voice. Grant and Priya were already seated, along with Priya's father, Anand Raghavan, a sharp, silver-haired man reviewing paperwork with the unhurried confidence of someone who does this for a living. When the closing officer checked me in at the front desk and read my name aloud for the sign-in sheet, Anand's head snapped up. "Wait," he said. "You're that Isabel Foreman? The one on the old trust transfer from the Whitcomb estate." I hadn't expected anyone outside my own family to recognize that name from an 11-year-old document. It turned out Anand's firm had, coincidentally, handled the original estate liquidation work back when my grandmother's trust dissolved, and he remembered the file specifically because it had been unusually thorough for such a small estate. "I actually complimented whoever drafted that trust," he said. "It was cleaner than most estates 10 times its size." My mother, seated beside my father near the back of the room, went visibly pale. "There's an unresolved interest on this property," I said, calm, my voice even, sliding the folder across the table. "I'm not here to block the sale. I'm here because nobody bothered to tell me my name was still attached to it, and nobody bothered to tell your family's own closing company either." "Isabel, this doesn't need to happen right now," my mother said, her voice sharp and tight. "This is Grant's day." "It's also apparently my document," I said. "You knew about this. I have the message where you told Grant not to mention my name to the title company." For one moment, my mother's composure genuinely cracked, a flash of real fear crossing her face before she caught herself. "I didn't want to complicate things," she said, quieter now. "You'd already stepped back from this family. I didn't think it was fair to drag you back into it over paperwork." "It wasn't your paperwork to decide was mine or not," I said. Anand, to his credit, simply said the closing would need to be rescheduled until the title issue was formally cleared, a minor delay. Nothing dramatic, purely procedural from his perspective. The closing happened 3 weeks later, my formal release signed and notarized, a modest but real settlement paid to me for the residual interest, $22,000, more symbolic than significant, but mine, acknowledged on the record. My mother has not fully spoken to me since, beyond a stiff, obligatory thank you for handling things properly. My father sent a single text afterward. "Your mother should have told you years ago." Grant, to my genuine surprise, called me 2 weeks later, quieter than I'd heard him in years, and admitted he hadn't known about the buried group chat message until Anand mentioned it to him directly. "I didn't know she asked me to hide you from the paperwork," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions. I haven't fully forgiven him. But I didn't hang up either. Let me go back and fill in something I skipped past too quickly, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how deep this had been running before that closing room ever happened. The divorce my mother called Isabel's situation wasn't the scandal she made it sound like at every holiday dinner for 3 years running. My ex-husband, Derek, had been quietly siphoning money out of our joint accounts for the better part of 2 years, funding a relationship he was having with a coworker 45 minutes away. A fact I only discovered because I noticed, in the course of doing my own job, a pattern of withdrawals that didn't match anything we'd actually spent money on. I left within 6 weeks of finding out. I didn't cry publicly. I didn't make a scene at family dinners. I simply handled it quietly, the same way I handle a messy chain of title, methodically, without drama until it was resolved. My mother's version of events, repeated at every family gathering since, was some vague, unspecified insinuation that I'd driven Derek away through being too focused on work. A story she never fully committed to out loud, but let hang in the air anyway. The kind of thing said with a sympathetic head tilt rather than an actual sentence. Grant, for his part, never corrected her, mostly because correcting our mother had never once worked out well for anyone in our family's history. I want to be fair to my parents in this story, because I don't think either of them woke up one day and decided to be cruel. I think my mother genuinely believed that protecting Grant's image in front of Priya's family was the more urgent priority, and that quietly managing me out of view was simply efficient. The way you'd smooth over an inconvenient stain rather than address why it happened in the first place. That doesn't make it kind. It just makes it explainable, which I've learned isn't the same thing as forgivable, though it's closer to it than pure cruelty would have been. The 2 years of silence between the mortgage refusal and the engagement party weren't entirely empty, either, and I think it's worth being specific about what actually filled them, because the version of this story where I simply disappeared and reappeared triumphant isn't quite honest. I threw myself into work in a way that was as much escape as ambition. I got my professional certification in real property law that most examiners never bother pursuing, specifically because the coursework gave me something to focus on during a year when I otherwise would have spent too many evenings alone with my own thoughts. I started running, slowly at first, then seriously, eventually finishing a half marathon in Sacramento that no one in my family knew I trained for, let alone completed. I found a small, unglamorous kind of pride in building a life that didn't require anyone's approval to feel complete. Marcus, the structural engineer I mentioned, came into my life about 8 months before any of this closing room drama unfolded. Introduced through a mutual friend at a wine bar neither of us particularly liked, but kept returning to out of habit. He was steady in a way I hadn't experienced before, the kind of steady that comes from genuinely liking who you are rather than needing anyone else to confirm it. When I finally told him 6 months in about the divorce, about my family's particular flavor of quiet exclusion, he didn't offer sympathy so much as a simple, grounding observation. It sounds like you spent years being punished for the one time you actually stood up for yourself. I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms before, and something about hearing it said plainly, without drama, made it easier to carry. I want to go back to the moment in that closing room, because there's a detail I skipped that I think matters. After Anand Raghavan recognized my name, and before my mother's composure cracked, there was a strange, suspended silence in that room. Maybe 4 or 5 seconds, though it felt considerably longer, where everyone seemed to be waiting to see which version of events would win. The one where I was an inconvenient complication to be managed, or the one where I was simply, factually, a person with a legitimate claim sitting in a chair with as much right to be there as anyone else. I remember consciously deciding, in that silence, not to fill it with an explanation or an apology for existing in the room. I just waited, the same way you wait during a closing for the final signature page, patient and unbothered, because the paperwork does the talking eventually whether you rush it or not. Priya, to her credit, was the one who broke that silence first, not her father, not my mother, but Priya herself, turning to Grant with a look of genuine confusion. "Wait," she said. "Is this your sister? Why has nobody ever mentioned her?" It was such a simple, obvious question, the kind of person outside a family's particular dysfunction asks without any of the loaded history attached, and it landed harder in that room than almost anything I could have said myself. Grant didn't have a good answer. He still, as far as I know, doesn't. The 3 weeks between that stalled closing and the eventual resolved one were quieter than I expected. My mother called twice, both times to ask, carefully, whether I intended to make a scene at the rescheduled closing, a question that told me more about her own anxiety than any real concern for my behavior, since I'd never once raised my voice through any of this. I told her both times that I intended to show up, sign what needed signing, and leave, which is exactly what happened. The settlement itself, that $22,000, wasn't life-changing money by any measure, and I want to be honest that it was never really about the dollar figure. What mattered was the formal, notarized acknowledgement sitting in a county record, permanently now, stating plainly that Isabel Foreman held and released a documented interest in that property, a fact nobody in my family could quietly edit out of a family narrative the way they'd edited me out of a party invitation. Some truths you can leave off a guest list. You cannot leave them off a deed. Grant's wedding to Priya happened 4 months later, a smaller, quieter ceremony than the elaborate affair my mother had originally been planning. Largely because Priya, I learned afterward, had specifically requested it be scaled back once she understood more of what our family dynamics actually looked like underneath the surface. I was invited this time, seated at the family table rather than tucked in the back, and Priya made a point of introducing me to her extended family herself, unprompted, simply as Grant's sister, who I actually really like. It was such a small sentence. It undid more than I expected it to. My mother and I are speaking again, cautiously. The way you test weight on ice you're not entirely sure will hold you. We don't discuss the closing room directly. We discuss, instead, small, safer things: a recipe, a weather forecast, Grant's new house. I've stopped waiting for a formal apology, mostly because I've come to understand it may never arrive in the shape I once imagined I needed it in, and I've made a kind of quiet peace with that. Here's what I actually learned. Standing in that closing room and watching a stranger recognize my own name faster than my own mother would ever acknowledge it. You don't need anyone's invitation to matter in a story that already has your name written into it. People can leave you off a guest list as many times as they want. They can't erase you from a deed. If this hit close to home, tell me in the comments what your family tried to quietly leave off the paperwork of your own life. Subscribe if you want to see how these stories keep unfolding for people who stopped waiting for an invitation and just kept the documentation instead. I'll see you in the next one.